but let me nonetheless try to say them. I will try to be brief since we have already lost some time, and I won't take up the full 30 minutes. But I think it's important for us to accept your challenge, Anselmo, to look at the roles of these different powerful organizations, the G7, the G20, and I'm not so sure the BRICS are particularly powerful, but how they are dealing with the governance and other related challenges, and particularly in how they are contributing to or undermining the UN agenda. And of course, I'm referring primarily to that of the General Assembly. And also, I would like to say something about what might be done at the end. But that, I suspect, is what my colleagues on the other panelists are trying to do. So let me emphasize that we have a situation where the G20 is, has existed for quite some time, and initially, in response to the global financial crisis of 2008, it did play some useful roles in terms of coordinating the response, and also it discouraged a big turn towards protectionism. It is important to note that the global financial crisis provided the excuse to reverse trade globalization. And we have seen a setback, we have seen a reversal of trade globalization ever since that time. Although some people would argue that it begins even earlier at the end of the 20th century in some instances. Now, very importantly, it had very little room for development. I particularly want to mention this because at that time I was working for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and we proposed a global Green New Deal. And Prime Minister Gordon Brown promised to respond to that with the second summit of the G20 in London. But unfortunately, he didn't really deliver. What he did deliver was 1.1 trillion, which was 100 billion more than what we had proposed, 1 trillion. But instead of committing those resources to the Global Green New Deal, 80% of it went to the IMF, and about the balance mainly went to the World Bank. There was very little for developing countries. And if we look at what happened to the IMF resources, the additional IMF resources, most of them went to the so-called PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Very little has actually gone to developing countries. So it's important to recognize that that initiative, while important and successful to some extent, did not do very much to contribute to development. Now, another important development, of course, is to recognize that at the same time, the aftermath of the global financial crisis saw the strengthening of financial governance in favor of the powerful financial interests in the world. I won't go into all the details, but importantly, there was an attempt, especially after Dominique Strauss-Kahn was removed as the managing director of the IMF, to use the IMF increasingly for such purposes. And also the Bank of International Settlements. And I think it's important for us to recognize that there was a great deal of mutual surveillance outside of the IMF. In other words, intergovernmental organizations were beginning to be bypassed in very important ways. It's important to also recognize that the G20 institutionalization, while nominally involving the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, of course, the Bretton Woods institutions are very curious multilateral organizations. It is $1, one vote, rather than one country, one vote. But still, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, are both multilateral. Are both at least nominally multilateral organizations. And very importantly, I think if we go back to the spirit of 1944, there is the potential of reforming it in such a way that it be much more democratic, because the original arrangements actually did provide for much more weight for the countries rather than by contribution. Now let's quickly look at what the G7 has been doing, and especially in recent times. I think it's very important to recognize that many of the G7 policies, the G7 is a self-appointed organization which was created initially as the G5, and then including Canada and Australia became the G7. But very importantly, in recent years, it has become increasingly regressive. If you look, for example, at the G7 proposals, when Boris Johnson was chair of the G7, he hosted a meeting in Cornwall 2 or 3 years ago. And at that meeting of the G7, instead of accepting the proposal for an international corporate income tax rate of 25%, which came from the International Commission headed by Stiglitz and Ocampo, currently the finance minister of Colombia. Basically, what we saw was a reduction of that from 25% to 21%, which was Janet Yellen's proposal, and then further reduction to only 15%. And the terms of the distribution of the taxation are also quite regressive, but I won't get into too many details right now. Just suffice to say that this is not a progressive proposal. I've already mentioned that trade liberalization has been reversed since the end of the 20th century after the establishment of the WTO, and very importantly for our purposes, the creation of the TRIPS appendix to the WTO's as articles of terms of agreement. And it's also important to recognize that there have been many other developments which have been more unilateral. Most recently, for example, under President Trump, he introduced the idea of reshoring investments from the US into China and into back to the US. That failed. And both Trump as well as Prime Minister Abe at that time of Japan opted, instead of reshoring, they decided to go for what is called friendshoring. In other words, there are sanctions on investments. Now, it sounds, oh yeah, you're targeting China, which is your rival. It sounds very simple. But one has to recognize that for many developing countries, especially in Southeast Asia, the single largest trading partner is actually China. And the other developing countries are part of these supply chains. So when you sanction China, you're also sanctioning many of China's trading partners who are involved in these supply chains. Now, another thing to note, of course, is that there is also more than a trade war. There's a very intense technology war. We have seen since 1995, the strengthening of TRIPS. The late President Mandela fought very hard against TRIPS, particularly to create the public health exception. It seemed to be agreed to in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. But then it was, as we know, the Indian and South African proposal to have a waiver for pandemic requirements, not only the vaccines, but also treatments, tests, etc., was rejected by the WTO Ministerial Council, basically by the West. We have also seen what has happened, as you all know, since a few years ago with Huawei, and more recently, a whole factory, a whole fabrication plant, TSM, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, has been relocated to Arizona. And likewise, there are similar pressures on Samsung to move its semiconductor production capacities to the US, basically in an attempt for the US to have technology monopolies. So I think it's very important to recognize that while there's a lot of neoliberal rhetoric about markets, what we are really talking about increasingly are monopolies. And of course, we know that in the last 1 year or so, the US Fed has raised interest rate hikes, and that has basically been followed by many other countries, central banks raising the interest rates. The major exception, of course, has been Japan, and that's a very important exception. But there are also other countries which are now beginning to resist. But all this, nonetheless, has had an effect of raising interest rates throughout the world and has slowed down economies throughout the world, because the cost of financing has gone up, not only for consumption, but also for spending. So those who are already indebted, both at the personal and household level, as well at the national level, face a very, very serious threats in the near future. Unlike before, as we saw in the case of Sri Lanka and Zambia more recently, many of these problems are going to be much more intractable, very difficult to resolve, because most of the debt is no longer with banks. They are in the form of bonds and other financial instruments. Now, moving on very quickly, I think it is important to recognize that the financing of the US fiscal deficit, which has, of course, increased with the war, war in Ukraine, has basically meant capital outflows from all developing countries, and even from some of the rich countries. And I've already mentioned the OECD so-called inclusive framework tax deal, which really does not allow developing countries to have a voice and participation at the table. They are relegated to secondary observer status. You either if you want to join the meetings, you have to agree to accept the outcome, even though you have no voice in no role in determining the outcome. That's the kind of world in which we are living in, but the OECD can get away with it. And the entire West, and in fact, all the rich countries and a few developing countries are members of the OECD. And of course, we know about the political situation, military spending, and so on. The Sustainable Development Goals, as you all know, have basically largely been forgotten, and even climate goals have largely been forgotten. Germany which has never met its obligations to provide overseas development assistance, has been able to triple its military spending over the last year. It has been, and likewise with other countries. Germany is now turning to coal, and other European countries are now going back to coal. And we are seeing extreme weather events becoming very, very significant and very serious. Now, moving on very quickly, I think it's important to remember that there is BRICS. But who are the BRICS? They're basically large developing countries, which is important, but not representative of the developing world. And of course, South Africa was included in the original BRICS, but it's still not representative. Now there are various proposals to include a few other countries, notably Indonesia, Nigeria, and a number of other countries, even Turkey and so on, are being mentioned. They were part of the so-called MINT group. I can't remember what M stands for, but Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, which might join will make it even more unwieldy. And as you know, with the change of governments in India and Brazil, in the recent period, the role of BRICS has actually declined. The Development Bank of the South, which the Chinese are financing, principal financier of, has not really developed very much compared to the Asian Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So let's remember that BRICS is not it was a creation of a clever English columnist, Jim O'Neill, very influential guy. But it is yet another self-selecting group, right? And it has not even functioned effectively as a caucus within the G20. Okay, so the regime changes in Brazil more recently have seen a significant change in the case of Brazil, but it's still not clear what it will mean. hosting these meetings. We have seen Indonesia recently hosting the G20 meeting and so on. But I think since the heyday about a decade ago, when G20 summit meetings counted for something, the world doesn't hold its breath looking to the G20. And if you look at the G20 proposal compared to the IMF proposal for the most indebted countries, the poorest countries in the world, it's really nothing to shout about. It's worse than the IMF proposal. So what do we see? It's very difficult to see what is likely to happen. But I do not have huge expectations, and perhaps being from a small country myself, I do not have huge expectations. But I think, sorry, I'm also forgot to mention that there are other candidate countries such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which are being sorry, I mentioned Turkey and Argentina, which are being considered. Now, moving very quickly, I think it is important to remember that what Europe used to be at the end of the 20th century, a little more guilty about its history of colonialism. Today, the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Borrell, Josep Borrell, he considers the rest of the world to be, basically the barbarians are at the door. Okay, as this quote from Mr. Borrell reminds us. So, in the past, people used to think that, oh, perhaps we could get a better deal from the Europeans, slightly more enlightened and so on. I think let's not have any illusions about that happening. So we have a situation where we have a worsening stagnation, and many of you might, some of the older ones in the audience might remember that when Mr. Volcker raised interest rates at the beginning of the 80s, and he was so successful, he managed to bring end inflation. Not only he ended inflation, he also ended growth, and it was left to President Reagan to reverse his raising of interest rates, and that, of course, was important in terms of improving the situation in the US. But as far as the rest of the world, especially the developing world, was concerned, it was disastrous. Latin America had a decade of lost decade. Some people would now say lost 2 decades, and Africa lost a quarter of a century. Yeah, and only began to growing more recently at the beginning of this century. So then we have seen since the global financial crisis, as I mentioned, we have unconventional monetary instruments, which have really not done very much for most of the world. And the recent interest rate hikes in the last year are having disastrous effects, which I've already mentioned. The global warming effects, as we know, are worse, and it's especially bad in the tropical zone. Okay, we have seen, for example, in Pakistan, huge so-called once-in-a-century events. Okay, but it's happened twice within a decade in Pakistan. The floods which recently happened were really of a magnitude which have never been seen for a long time. 33 million people being displaced, and so on and so forth. So these are not minor events, okay? And one can go on about that. Much of Bangladesh, for example, is experiencing rising sea levels, less and less land. Bangladesh is relatively low-lying, much of it at least, and it has much less land available for agriculture. In Vietnam last year, there were at least 8 provinces which had serious inundation of saline water from the sea, and basically we have seen a major setback as far as food production is concerned. Commodity prices, of course, have declined since the middle of the last decade, and this has had important effects. And now we have the sanctions have become relatively legitimized as economic weapons. I don't know who legitimized them. Certainly, they violate the UN Charter in very fundamental ways. But nonetheless, these are seen as normal instruments today. Nobody even questions them in international parlance, especially among NATO countries, but also, as we know, in the case of Japan and so on. So we have seen a very difficult and dangerous situation happening on various fronts: investment, technology, finance, etc., etc. And initially, the combination of the climate problem, COVID-19 conflict, basically also saw various types of inflation on the supply side. So the kind of instruments which the US Fed have been introducing basically will not address supply side problems. For those of you who may not be familiar with the economic arguments, basically, it's economics 101. In fact, people don't even study economics know that, when that the reason you raise interest rates is to reduce demand. So it's a demand side problem you're addressing. But when you have a supply disruption, for example, due to the pandemic, or more recently due to the war and so on, how does raising interest rates address that? It does not at all. And we have seen, in fact, that the raising the higher prices basically happened in the second quarter of 2022. They have in the US, prices have not gone up did not go up in the second half of 2022. Okay, sorry, prices did go up, but it is not accelerating. And one of the arguments in economics is that you only need to be concerned about inflation if it is accelerating. So even in terms of conventional macroeconomic theory, what is being done is completely unnecessary, but it is having a devastating effect on the rest of the world. Now, inflation targeting is often talked about as normalized now. 33 years ago, inflation targeting was first started by New Zealand. The finance minister at that time simply said to the central bank, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, said, he was going to introduce a new slogan, 2 by 92. Okay, 2 by the year 1992. That was how he came up with it, because it rhymed. Okay, it had nothing to do with any economics. So when US Fed chair with his glasses at the end of his nose talks very seemingly wisely about how he remains committed to this 2% target, let us remember that this 2% target is plucked out of thin air. It has got no basis even in conventional economics. Okay, so it is a blunt tool, and worse still, it is inappropriate. And basically, it has reduced spending demand, further slowing down the world economy in disastrous ways. And I seriously fear, because the national debt levels are even higher now than they were in the 1980s. What we are likely to see is increasing debt catastrophes for some countries, not necessarily the poorer countries, because many poorer countries do not even have a credit rating to allow them to borrow. What we have seen so far are middle-income countries with incomes such as Sri Lanka and so on, who have gone into this situation. And of course, when you have a problem like that, what do? You create a bogeyman. And of course, China, the so-called debt trap diplomacy, which has got no basis in fact. As the US magazine, Atlantic magazine, in an investigative journalism pointed out, it's all bogus. But nonetheless, we hear, none other than Janet Yellen and others going around the world talking about the debt trap diplomacy and how we must be very, very careful about it. So we have a situation where there was a real threat of stagnation and inflation. But as I said, in our own recent calculations since the second half of 2022, there is no evidence of accelerating inflation, and I would say US stagflation is now unlikely, but it is still possible that it might happen in the rest of the world because of the various forces which have developed in the world. So it is also important for us to recognize that the period of globalization understood primarily as trade liberalization is largely over. And I won't get into all the details, but I think it's important to recognize that now we have various other disruptions, including the sanctions, which I mentioned, but which are much more deliberate. And of course, actions such as, for example, throwing countries out, such as Russia, out of the SWIFT financial payment system. This, of course, makes things difficult for Russia and so on, but it also encourages many other countries to look for alternative payment systems. So this instrument, this weapon which has been invoked, may well have unintended consequences. Now, let me go back very quickly to what I believe to be the appropriate solution in our times, and that is a return to non-alignment. I can go through the history of non-alignment in the past, but I won't do that because we have very limited time, and I've already delayed the event, albeit unintentionally. But what we have right now is a situation where where we have a new Cold War. This began, I would argue, since the end of the Bush Jr. period, with Paul Wolfowitz becoming the secretary and coming up with the Wolfowitz doctrine around 2007. And the expulsion of Putin. At one time, George W. Bush said he had looked into the eyes of Putin and seen God there, but obviously, he, maybe he blinked and God was no longer there. But in any case, what we have seen since then is various developments of the Cold War, and very importantly, this is largely centered around East Asia. The encirclement of China, the so-called pivot to Asia, as Barack Obama used to remind the world, and then this was continued, of course, by Mr. Trump and also by Mr. Biden. So they've shot down this balloon, and many people think it is much ado about nothing, but because it's whether balloons are slow-moving balloons are really not going to get much more intelligence than say satellites in space and so on. But in any case, it makes for good publicity. It allows Blinken not to go to China. After all, he had invited himself, and so on. So we see a very, very dangerous situation where the world is being drawn into these conflicts. The US conflict with China, and then more recently with Russia, and this, of course, and even people like Mearsheimer, his argument is to stop fighting with Russia, focus on China. We see this problem. The only country really at war directly with China right now actually happens to be India. And it's very interesting that even Narendra Modi is not particularly endorsing many of the actions which have been taken for a variety of reasons. So the appropriate response, I would argue, is a pacifist, developmental non-alignment. And that, of course, is easier said than done. But I think we should think about elaborating that challenge to us, and basically begin to think very seriously about how the world has changed. And I want to just quickly emphasize how the world has changed in some very important ways. I want to emphasize that nobody really talks about the Washington Consensus anymore. It's still there, still very powerful, but it's not really the real problem for many developing countries. The big problem now is the power of Davos. And Davos is more insidious precisely because it is an unelected world elite. Okay, it's private corporate power which is exercising influence, and this is very important. The other thing, of course, is the law itself. And I think it's very important for us to remember that the rule of law, whether it manifests through the WTO or through TRIPS, has been very, very biased towards the rich and powerful countries and not against developing countries. So even in the question of when you talk about so-called rights-based approach, when you talk to most lawyers are not talking about human rights, okay? And they are talking essentially about property rights, contractual rights, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important for us to be very careful in thinking about the duties and obligations rather than rights in and of itself, particularly because developing countries are facing huge debt problems and they constrain the fiscal space and of course indirectly constrain the policy space. Now, where do governments and social movements, civil society fit into all this? This, of course, is the subject which all of you are addressing. And once again, let me apologize for my delay in participating, in joining you today. Thank you very much, Anselmo. Thank you all. And I hope this has been useful.